He smiled the second the envelope touched his hands, because he was already sure of what it would say. He had spent 3 months building a story in his head, a story where I was the liar and he was the victim, and this piece of paper was supposed to be his proof. He tore it open in front of me at our own kitchen table, confident, almost cheerful, the way a man looks right before he thinks he's won. Then his eyes moved to the last page, and everything about his face changed, because the last page wasn't about me at all. It was about him. And once he understood what it meant, he understood that he was the one who had just handed me the weapon that would end his marriage, his reputation, and the life he thought he had hidden so carefully. Stay with me, because this story gets darker before it gets better, and if it resonates with you, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear that the truth always finds a way out. My name is Ivy Calloway, and for 6 years, I believed my marriage was the one part of my life that was safe. I grew up watching my parents' relationship fall apart slowly, quietly, the kind of unraveling nobody names until it's already over, and I promised myself I would never build a life on a foundation I hadn't tested. So when I met Reed, I tested everything. I watched how he treated waitstaff, how he spoke about his ex-girlfriends, how he handled stress on bad days at work. He passed every version of that test I could think to give him. What I didn't know was that the test I never thought to run was the one that mattered most. I worked as a pediatric nurse at a hospital outside Charlotte, a job that taught me to read people quickly, because children can't always tell you what's wrong, and their parents are often too frightened to explain it clearly. I was good at my job. I was calm in emergencies. I noticed small details other people missed. It's strange, looking back, that a woman who could spot a subtle infection in a 2-year-old from across a room somehow missed the signs sitting across her own dinner table for years. Reed worked in commercial real estate, the kind of job that came with long lunches, late meetings, and a schedule that shifted depending on which deal was closing that week. I never questioned it, because why would I? We had built a life that looked, from the outside, like something people envied. A house with a wraparound porch. A dog named Baxter, who slept between us most nights. And 11 months before that envelope landed on our kitchen table, we had a daughter. We named her Marlo. Marlo changed everything, the way a first child always does, but she also changed something in Reed that I couldn't name at the time. In the hospital, holding her for the first time, he cried the way I'd never seen him cry, and I remember thinking that whatever cracks existed in us before, they had just been sealed shut by this small, furious, red-faced little girl. I was wrong. What actually happened is that Marlo's arrival didn't seal anything. It opened something. And it would take me 11 months to understand what that something was. The shift started so gradually, I almost couldn't point to a single day it began. Reed started staying later at the office, which I attributed to a new development deal he mentioned constantly, something called the Ashcombe Project that apparently required endless site visits and client dinners. He started keeping his phone face down on the counter, which he had never done before, not even when we were dating. He started answering questions about his day in single words, when he used to tell me stories about difficult clients and funny things his coworkers said. None of it was alarming on its own. All of it together formed a shape I refused to look at directly. There was one night, about 4 months after Marlo was born, when Reed came home smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't mine. I noticed it the second he leaned down to kiss my forehead, and my whole body went still in a way that felt almost clinical, like I was assessing a patient instead of my own husband. I asked him about it, lightly, the way you ask a question you're afraid to actually get an honest answer to. He said one of the partners at his firm had hugged him goodbye after a closing dinner, and that she always wore too much perfume, and everyone complained about it. I laughed. I let it go. I told myself that a woman who spent her career trusting her instincts about children's bodies should also learn to trust them a little less about her own husband, because suspicion, left unchecked, could poison something good. I wish I had trusted myself instead. Looking back now, I can identify a dozen smaller moments from that same stretch of time that I filed away without examining, the way you file away a strange noise in your car engine because the drive home was otherwise uneventful. There was the weekend he suddenly needed to attend a real estate conference 2 states away, a conference I later learned from a colleague of his who mentioned it in passing months afterward, that his firm hadn't actually sent anyone to that year. There was the new gym membership he started at a location almost 40 minutes from our house, when a gym sat less than 10 minutes from his office. There was the way he started locking his laptop with a passcode he'd never used before, mentioning it only once, casually, as a work security requirement from IT. None of these things, on their own, would have alarmed anyone. Together, they were building towards something I simply refused to assemble in my mind, because assembling it meant accepting a version of my life I wasn't ready to hold. 3 weeks later, Marlo caught a fever that wouldn't break for 2 days, and in the chaos of pediatrician visits and sleepless nights, Reed's behavior slid even further from my attention. It wasn't until the fever broke and our house went quiet again that I noticed something that had been sitting in front of me the entire time. Reed had started asking questions about Marlo that a father doesn't usually ask. Small questions, disguised as jokes. He'd hold her up to the light and say she didn't look like either of us, and laugh like it was nothing. He'd mention, almost too casually, that his brother's babies had all come out with his family's exact eye color, and Marlo's eyes were nothing like that. At first, I thought he was simply tired, making the kind of tired parent jokes exhausted people make at 2 in the morning. But the jokes didn't stop. They multiplied. And underneath every one of them was something colder than humor. Then, on a Tuesday evening in early spring, Reed came home holding a small cardboard box, the kind that ships from those consumer genetics companies, the ones people use to trace their ancestry or check for inherited conditions. He set it on the counter without any preamble and told me, in the same tone he might use to announce he'd picked up groceries, that he wanted to do a paternity test. Not an ancestry test. A paternity test. For Marlo. I remember the exact sensation of that moment because it wasn't anger that hit me first. It was disbelief, sharp and disorienting, the kind that makes you replay a sentence in your head because you're sure you must have misheard it. I asked him why. He wouldn't look at me directly when he answered. He said he just wanted peace of mind, that it was a formality, that plenty of men did this quietly, and it meant nothing about how he felt about me. But his voice had none of the softness that phrase should have carried. It had the flat, rehearsed quality of something he had said to himself in the mirror, over and over, until it sounded reasonable. I agreed to the test because refusing would have looked like I had something to hide, and I had nothing to hide. I knew, with absolute certainty, that Marlo was his daughter. There had been no one else, not once, not for a single day of our marriage. But there is a particular kind of humiliation in being asked to prove your own faithfulness to the person who is supposed to trust you most, and that humiliation sat in my chest for the entire 3 weeks it took the lab to process the samples. I remember calling my sister, Dana, the night the swab kit arrived in the mail, because I needed someone outside the walls of my own house to tell me I wasn't overreacting. Dana had never fully trusted Reed, something she'd never said outright until that call, and hearing her finally admit it, calmly, without any satisfaction in her voice, only made the ground under me feel less solid. She asked me one question that I couldn't shake for the rest of that night. She asked, "Ivy, if you already know the answer, why does he need the paper to prove it?" I didn't have a good answer for her then. I would have one eventually, but it wasn't the answer either of us expected. During those 3 weeks of waiting, I started noticing something else, something smaller and stranger than anything before it. Reed began talking, almost wistfully, about starting fresh. He'd bring it up in odd, disconnected moments, while we were loading the dishwasher or driving to his mother's house for Sunday dinner. He'd mention how nice it would be to live somewhere without so much history, or how he sometimes envied people who got to build a life without complications already baked into it. At the time, I assumed he meant our finances, or the stress of new parenthood. I didn't yet understand that he was rehearsing, out loud, the emotional permission he was giving himself to leave. During those 3 weeks, something in Reed shifted again, and this time the shift was unmistakable. He became lighter, almost giddy. He started coming home earlier instead of later. I watched his eyes move down the first page, and I watched the smile hold steady because the first page confirmed the biological result in plain clinical language. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. Reed Calloway was, without any statistical doubt, Marlowe's biological father. For one strange moment, I thought that would be the end of it. I thought he would look up, apologize, maybe even cry the way he had in the hospital 11 months earlier. Instead, his smile faltered, then froze, then collapsed entirely, and his eyes dropped to the second page. I didn't understand yet why a result confirming he was the father would break him instead of relieve him. It would take me another 20 minutes, and a conversation I will never forget, to understand exactly what he had seen. Because the last page of that report wasn't about Marlowe at all. Genetic testing companies, the kind used for paternity results, don't just compare a father and a child in isolation. Somewhere in that lab system, buried in cross-referencing software designed to flag potential relatives who had also submitted samples through affiliated services, Reed's DNA had matched against another profile already on file. The report's final page, the one companies attach almost as a courtesy, a footnote most people never expect to matter, listed a probable half-sibling match for Marlowe. A boy, age 4, living 2 states away. A name I had never heard before in my life. Caleb. I remember asking Reed, my voice strange and far away even to my own ears, who Caleb was. And I remember watching my husband, a man who built his identity around being calm and controlled in every room he walked into, completely lose the ability to speak. It took him almost a full minute to answer, and when he finally did, the words came out in fragments, the kind of confession that arrives only when a person has run out of other options. Caleb was his son. Born 4 years earlier, before Marlowe, before the version of our marriage I thought I understood, from a relationship he'd had during what he called a rough patch early in our marriage, a phrase that made my stomach turn because I remembered that rough patch differently. I remembered it as the year I was working double shifts to help pay off his student loans while he told me he was too exhausted most nights to talk. I remembered it as the year I thought we were building something together. He remembered it, apparently, as the year he was building a second family on the side. The woman's name was Vanessa, the V from the calendar reminder. She had gotten pregnant, and rather than tell me, rather than face what that would cost him, Reed had quietly paid child support through a private arrangement, kept in contact through a separate phone line I never knew existed, and constructed an entire second life that ran parallel to ours for 4 years without a single thread of it ever touching the surface of our marriage. And here is the detail that turned my shock into something closer to fury. Reed hadn't ordered that paternity test for Marlowe because he doubted me. He had ordered it because, somewhere in the back of his mind, some cruel arithmetic had convinced him that if he could prove Marlowe wasn't his, he would have a clean, guilt-free reason to leave our marriage and finally move toward the family he'd been quietly building with Vanessa the entire time. He wasn't trying to catch me in a lie. He was trying to manufacture an exit for himself, one where he got to be the wronged husband instead of the man who'd spent 4 years lying to everyone who trusted him. He hadn't expected the lab system to expose his own secret in the process. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after he finished talking, watching him wait, almost hopefully for me to say something that would let him off the hook, the way you'd watch a patient waiting for a diagnosis you already know is bad. I didn't give him that. I stood up, walked into Marlowe's nursery, and closed the door, because I needed one uninterrupted hour to understand what my life actually was, instead of what I had believed it to be for 6 years. Standing in that nursery, listening to Marlowe breathe in her crib, I found myself doing something strange. I started counting backward through our marriage, year by year, trying to locate the exact point where the man I married had started becoming someone else, or whether that man had ever fully existed at all, or whether I had simply built him out of the parts of Reed that were convenient to see. I thought about our wedding day, the way he'd cried during his vows, and I wondered, standing there in the dark, whether those tears had been real in the moment and simply hadn't been strong enough to hold him to anything, or whether I had misread even that. I didn't reach an answer that night. I'm not sure there is a clean answer to a question like that, but I understood, standing over my daughter's crib, that whatever the truth of who Reed had been on our wedding day, the truth of who he'd become was no longer something I could build a future around. Over the following days, Reed tried every version of an explanation a person can try. He said it happened before Marlowe, so it didn't count against our current family. He said he had been planning to tell me eventually, once the timing felt right. a claim that meant nothing coming from a man who had let 4 years pass without ever finding that timing. He said the child support payments were small and private, structured so I would never notice a strain on our finances, as if the fact that he'd successfully hidden it made the deception smaller instead of larger. Every excuse he offered was really just a description of how carefully he had planned to never get caught. What made it worse, in a way I hadn't expected, was learning that Vanessa herself had believed, for years, that Reed was separated from me, or at least deeply unhappy in a marriage that was ending. He had apparently told her a version of our life that painted me as cold, distant, and uninterested in him, a story he needed her to believe so that she would stay patient while he juggled both worlds. When I eventually managed, through a mutual contact neither of them expected me to find, to speak with her directly, she was as stunned as I was. She hadn't known Marlowe existed. She hadn't known I was still fully in the dark about Caleb. She had believed she was the other, more honest relationship, when in truth she was simply the second lie running alongside the first. I want to be clear that I didn't reach out to Vanessa out of anger toward her. I reached out because I needed to know exactly how deep this went, and because some instinct told me that she deserved the truth as much as I did. We were, in an odd and painful way, allies against the same man, two women who had each been told a version of reality designed entirely around his comfort. That first conversation with Vanessa lasted almost 3 hours, most of it spent in a kind of stunned, careful comparison, the two of us trading dates and details like investigators building a timeline neither of us had wanted to build. She told me Reed had described me, early in their relationship, as someone who had checked out of the marriage years earlier, someone who worked constant overnight shifts and showed little interest in him outside of finances. I told her that those overnight shifts had been the ones funding the very lifestyle he'd used to court her, dinners and weekend trips he'd paid for with money that should have gone toward our joint savings account, an account I would later discover, through my attorney's financial review, had been quietly drained in small, unremarkable increments for years, always just below the threshold that might have triggered a conversation between us. There was a detail Vanessa mentioned near the end of that call that I still think about. She said that a few months after Caleb was born, she had asked Reed, gently, whether he thought he'd ever be able to leave his marriage and build something real with her and their son. She said he told her he was waiting for the right moment, a moment he promised was coming, a moment that would let him leave with a clean conscience instead of feeling like the villain in the story. I understood, hearing that, exactly what the DNA test had actually been. It wasn't a test of my faithfulness at all. It was Reed's attempt to manufacture the clean conscience he'd been promising Vanessa for 4 years, using our daughter as the instrument. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. I contacted a family law attorney the same week I learned about Caleb because whatever emotional processing I still needed to do, I understood that protecting Marlowe's future had to happen immediately and without hesitation. My attorney explained that the private child support arrangement Reed had maintained with Vanessa, structured entirely outside any court system to avoid it appearing on record, actually worked heavily in my favor once it came to light because it demonstrated a clear, sustained pattern of financial concealment from his marriage. Judges, she told me, tend to look very unfavorably on a spouse who has hidden significant financial obligations and dependents for years. Reed's family, when they learned what had happened, split almost immediately into 2 camps, in a way that told me everything I needed to know about who had actually known something all along. His mother called me within days, tearful, insisting she'd had no idea, and I believed her, because her shock seemed to genuinely rearrange something in her voice as she spoke. His younger brother, however, went quiet in a different way, the kind of quiet that comes from a person carrying a secret they're desperately hoping nobody asks them directly about. It took one direct question from me, delivered calmly over the phone, for him to admit that he had, in fact, met Caleb once at a birthday party 2 years earlier, and had been told by Reed to never mention it, framed as protecting the family from unnecessary stress. That detail broke something in me that the original discovery hadn't quite reached. It wasn't just my husband who had lied. It was an entire quiet infrastructure of people around him who had decided, individually and collectively, that my right to know the truth about my own marriage mattered less than his comfort. A week after that revelation, Reed's father requested a private conversation with me, without Reed present, at a coffee shop near the hospital where I worked. I almost didn't go because I no longer trusted anything that came wrapped in a request for privacy from that family. But curiosity and a small, stubborn hope that someone in that house might actually offer something honest got me into my car that afternoon. His father sat across from me, visibly uncomfortable, and told me something that reframed the entire 4 years for me all over again. He said Reed had once asked him, years earlier, for advice about handling 2 responsibilities at once, phrased vaguely enough at the time that his father assumed he meant work and fatherhood, not 2 entirely separate families running in parallel. His father hadn't known the specifics, but he admitted, quietly, staring into his coffee instead of at me, that some part of him had suspected something wasn't right, and he had chosen, the way people in that family seemed to specialize in choosing, not to ask the follow-up question that might have forced an answer he wasn't ready to hear. I left that coffee shop with a strange, hollow kind of clarity. I wasn't the only person Reed had built a wall of silence around. He had spent years training the people closest to him, deliberately or not, to look away from anything inconvenient, and I had simply been the divorce process moved faster than I expected, largely because Reed, faced with the mounting evidence of his financial concealment and the very real possibility of losing far more in court than he would through a fair settlement, chose not to fight most of the major points. I kept the house. I kept full physical custody of Marlowe, with a carefully structured visitation arrangement that my attorney insisted on documenting in exhaustive detail, because a man capable of hiding an entire second child for years was not a man I was willing to extend casual trust to going forward. What surprised me most, in the months that followed, was Caleb himself. Not directly, because I made a deliberate choice not to insert myself into that relationship in any active way, out of respect for a child who had done nothing wrong in any of this. But I learned, through the slow unraveling of information that happens after a divorce like this, that Caleb's mother eventually decided to pursue a full legal custody arrangement of her own, no longer willing to operate on the informal, hidden terms Reed had used to keep her quiet for years. Reed, who had spent 4 years constructing an elaborate architecture to avoid ever facing the full weight of either family's needs at once, suddenly found himself facing both, fully, publicly, and simultaneously. The court proceedings, when they finally converged, became something almost impossible for Reed to control the way he'd controlled every other part of this for years. Because our divorce and Vanessa's custody filing landed in overlapping timeframes, the financial concealment my attorney had flagged early on became relevant to both cases at once. A forensic accountant retained during discovery traced the small, steady withdrawals from our joint account back nearly 3 years, cross-referencing them against payments Vanessa had received, and the pattern that emerged was undeniable, printed out in black and white across a spreadsheet that made 4 years of quiet lying look, suddenly, almost clumsy. Reed sat through that hearing, according to my attorney who was present for part of it, with the same stunned, cornered expression he'd worn at our kitchen table the day the envelope arrived. The math had simply caught up to him, the way math eventually does to anyone who assumes no one is checking. I won't pretend I didn't feel something close to satisfaction watching the walls of his carefully built double life collapse all at once. But mostly what I felt was exhaustion, the specific kind that comes from realizing you spent 6 years building your entire emotional foundation on someone else's careful performance of honesty. There was a particular afternoon, about 5 months after everything came apart, when I sat in my attorney's office reviewing the final custody and financial paperwork, and I found myself thinking about that kitchen table moment, the one where Reed tore open that envelope smiling, so confident that the truth would finally be on his side. I understood, sitting there, that he had been half right.
The truth did come out that day.
It simply wasn't the truth he had spent 3 weeks preparing himself to hear. Before any of that rebuilding could begin, though, there was one last conversation with Reed that I think about more than almost anything else from that entire period. It happened about 2 weeks before the divorce was finalized, at a mediation session neither of us particularly wanted to be at. During a break, while our attorneys stepped out to review paperwork, Reed turned to me in the empty conference room and asked, quietly, whether I thought he was a bad person. I didn't answer right away, because I wanted the answer to be true rather than simply satisfying. I told him I didn't think he woke up 4 years ago intending to become someone who lived a double life. I think he made one small compromise, then another, then found himself so deep into the lie that honesty stopped feeling like an option and started feeling like a cliff. But I also told him that understanding how a person becomes dishonest doesn't excuse the years he spent being dishonest, and that the ordinary, human path he took to get there didn't make the destination any less devastating for the people standing in it. He didn't respond to that. He just nodded, the way people nod when they've heard something they already knew but had never let themselves say out loud. That conversation didn't heal anything, and I don't think it was supposed to. But it gave me something I hadn't expected to need, a version of closure that didn't depend on him ever fully admitting the scope of what he'd done. I stopped waiting for him to understand the full weight of it. I simply accepted that he might never get there, and I let myself move forward anyway. Rebuilding after something like this doesn't happen in one clean, satisfying moment, no matter how much we want our own stories to work that way. It happens slowly, in small decisions that add up over time. I went back to work full-time, throwing myself into the pediatric unit with a focus that surprised even my supervisors, and within a year I was offered a lead position on a new pediatric outreach program serving families who couldn't easily access regular health care. I said yes without hesitation, because for the first time in a long while, I wanted something that was entirely Marlo, now a toddler full of the specific chaos and joy only a 1.5-year-old can bring into a house, has no memory of any of this, and she never will. At least not from me. I made a decision early on that whatever happened between Reed and me, she would never grow up hearing her father described only through his worst moment. She would form her own understanding of him in her own time, based on how he actually shows up for her going forward, not on the story I could easily tell about him if I chose to. That decision hasn't always been easy to keep. There have been small moments, driving Marlo home after a weekend visit with Reed, when she'll say something offhand, some little detail about a new toy at Daddy's new house, or a mention of a name I don't recognize, and I've had to sit with the discomfort of not knowing that entire piece of her world, without letting that discomfort turn into questioning her the way an investigator questions a witness. She is a child, not a source of information about her father's life, and I remind myself of that distinction every time the old instinct to gather evidence tries to resurface. It's a strange kind of discipline, learning to let your child have an entire relationship you're not fully privy to, especially after spending months learning exactly how much can hide inside the parts of a life you're not privy to. But I've come to believe it's the only way to raise her without quietly handing her my own unresolved anger to carry. About 8 months after the divorce was finalized, I met someone through, of all places, a hospital fundraising event I helped organize for the new outreach program. His name was Julian, a pediatric occupational therapist who had transferred to our hospital system the previous year. What struck me about him wasn't anything dramatic or cinematic. It was how ordinary his honesty felt. He answered questions directly. He didn't disappear into vague explanations when something inconvenient came up. He mentioned, early on, a difficult breakup from years earlier, without minimizing his own mistakes in it, which felt, after everything, like the most attractive quality a person could possess. We've been together for a little over a year now, slowly, carefully, without either of us rushing toward anything neither of us is ready for. Marlo adores him, in the uncomplicated way small children adore anyone who gets down on the floor to build towers with them and pretends to be endlessly delighted every time those towers fall. There was a moment, about 4 months into knowing Julian, when I finally told him the entire story, not the shortened version I'd been giving casual acquaintances, but the whole thing, the calendar reminder, the soccer invite, the last page of that report. I braced myself. The way you brace for a reaction you've seen before, some mixture of pity and discomfort that makes a person quietly reconsider how complicated you are. Instead, he asked me one simple question. He asked whether Marlo still saw her father regularly, and whether I felt good about how that arrangement was going. It wasn't the question I expected, and it told me more about him than almost anything else could have. He wasn't interested in the scandal of it. He was interested in whether the people currently in my life, especially the smallest one, were being taken care of. That's when I understood that whatever this relationship became, it was being built on a completely different foundation than the one I'd lost. I've also had to relearn, slowly and sometimes clumsily, how to trust ordinary things again. A late text back. A quiet evening where Julian doesn't immediately explain every hour of his day. For a long time after the divorce, silence from someone I cared about felt like evidence of something hidden, because silence used to mean something specific in my old life. It has taken real, deliberate effort to separate the two, to remind myself that not every unexplained gap is a locked laptop or a calendar reminder with an initial instead of a name. Julian has never once made me feel foolish for needing that time, which, more than any single romantic gesture, is the thing that finally let me exhale. I think often about that envelope, and about the specific arrogance required to smile the way Reed smiled that day, so certain the truth would finally hand him the exit he'd been quietly engineering for years. What he never understood, what people like him rarely understand until it's far too late, is that the truth doesn't take sides. It doesn't care who is hoping it arrives in their favor. It simply arrives, complete, indifferent to who wanted which page to say what. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if that lab's cross-referencing system hadn't flagged Caleb's profile, if that last page had simply come back blank, the way Reed clearly assumed it would. I wonder how many more years that second life might have continued running quietly alongside mine, how many more birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday evenings I would have spent unknowingly sharing my husband with another family, believing all the while that the only thing wrong in my marriage was a man who'd grown a little distant after becoming a father. It's an uncomfortable thing to sit with, the idea that the only reason I know the truth about my own life is a footnote most people never expect to matter, attached almost as an afterthought to a report I only requested because he insisted on it. There's a strange kind of justice in that, the fact that the very test he ordered to build his own exit became the exact thing that exposed the door he'd already quietly built for himself years earlier. I've thought, too, about what I would say to a version of myself sitting at that kitchen table again, watching that smile freeze on his face. I think I would tell her not to feel guilty for the years she spent not noticing, because noticing was never actually the failure. The failure belonged entirely to the person who spent 4 years constructing something specifically designed to avoid being noticed. Some people are extraordinarily good at building that kind of architecture, and no amount of attentiveness on the other end can guarantee you'll see through it before it's ready to be seen. If there's one thing I'd want anyone listening to this to carry with them, it's this. If someone in your life is quietly preparing for a version of events that lets them walk away without consequence, pay attention to that quiet. Notice the small, disguised questions. Notice the sudden lightness before results are supposed to arrive. The truth has a way of showing up eventually, whether we go looking for it or not, and when it does, it rarely stops at the page anyone was expecting to read. I lost the marriage I thought I had. But somewhere underneath all of it, I found a version of my own life that no longer depends on anyone else's honesty to feel steady. And that, more than any settlement, more than any confrontation, more than any single page of any single report, is the part of this story I'm most grateful for. If you're sitting somewhere right now, noticing a strange lightness in someone right before results are supposed to arrive, or a locked laptop that never used to need a password, or a calendar reminder with an initial where a name should be, I hope you trust that unease instead of talking yourself out of it the way I did for months. You don't need a lab report to validate what you already sense. Sometimes the last page has already been written long before the envelope ever reaches your hands. The only real question is whether you're willing to keep reading once it does.